Two police officers arrested a man in front of his own home, then walked into court only to realize the man they had arrested was, in fact, the judge. They never asked for his identification, never questioned where he was headed, and never explained why they stopped him. All they saw was a black man sitting in a black BMW, parked by the curb on a quiet street in Plano, Texas. The engine was still running, the sound of soft jazz drifting from the car's speakers, and that was enough for them. Judge Raymond Ellison, 52 years old, a man with 3 decades of legal experience, a father to 2 grown children, and known for his calm and fair demeanor in the courtroom, was just trying to get home after a long day. He had been with his best friend, Calvin Lewis, who had just retired from the bench. They had shared drinks, hugs, and stories. He wasn't drunk. Ray didn't drink heavily. He was simply tired. Dressed in slacks and an old North Carolina ENT hoodie, nothing about him screamed, "Your Honor." Not that night. It was just after midnight when he parked in front of his own house, leaning back in the driver's seat for a moment of peace before heading inside. The porch light was still on, and the neighborhood was quiet. Then flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror. No siren. 2 officers stepped out, one on each side, a flashlight shining directly in his face. He rolled down his window halfway, trying to stay calm. "Evening, officers. Is there a problem?" he asked. They didn't respond with a greeting, only a command. "Turn off the engine. Keep your hands where we can see them." Ray did as instructed, his voice steady. "I live here. You can check the mailbox or I can show you my ID," he suggested. Another flashlight beam swept across the back seat. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," one of the officers ordered. Ray's patience was starting to wear thin. "I'm a sitting judge. You might want to—" Before he could finish, one of the officers opened his door and grabbed his arm. "What are you doing?" Ray asked, raising his hands. "I haven't done anything wrong." But by then, things had already escalated. The second officer had circled around, his hand hovering over his holster. "Stop resisting," the first officer barked. "I'm not resisting. I'm trying to identify myself," Ray protested, but they weren't listening. In the next instant, his head was shoved against the hood of his own car, his left cheek pressed into the cold metal. His wrists were yanked behind his back. "You're under arrest for failure to comply with a lawful order," one of the officers said. Neighbors started peeking through their windows as Judge Raymond Ellison, a 52-year-old father and respected legal professional, was treated like a criminal. Just another black man in handcuffs, arrested in front of his own home in the middle of the night, with no one bothering to ask his name. The next morning, they didn't take him downtown, just to a small station off Parker Road, a place with flickering lights and the stale smell of vending machine coffee. No one offered to call anyone. No one asked if he was okay. They didn't even bother to check his ID. They booked him like he was a nobody, fingerprints, mugshot, shoes off, belongings bagged. Ray sat in a holding cell for 6 hours, surrounded by the sounds of snoring, coughing, and occasional shouting from other cells. The concrete bench was cold, and his pride was bruised. He asked to speak to a supervisor twice, but both times the desk officer waved him off. The third time, the officer didn't even look up from his computer. "I'm Judge Raymond Ellison. Call your supervisor," Ray said firmly. The officer muttered, "Yeah, and I'm the mayor," still not looking up. No one made eye contact. No one gave him a name. To them, he was just another arrest to process and forget. It wasn't until 7:12 a.m. that someone from records finally scanned his driver's license, paused, stood still, and then quickly walked out of the room. Within 20 minutes, the whole tone shifted. A higher-ranking officer entered, apologized stiffly, and told him he was being released. No charges. A mistake. They called it a precautionary arrest, and that they were just following procedure. Ray didn't say a word as they handed back his watch, keys, and phone. He didn't look at anyone, just walked out the door, got into a cab, and rode home in silence. But the silence didn't last. By that evening, his attorney, Deborah Langston, had filed a formal complaint with Internal Affairs, not just for wrongful arrest, but for racial profiling, excessive force, and misconduct. "You sure you want to go through with this?" Deborah asked him on the phone. "You know how it'll look. Some folks will say you're just mad you didn't get special treatment." "I don't want special treatment," Ray answered, his voice quiet but firm. "I want what I'm owed as a citizen. I want what any black man should be owed. Dignity, respect, basic decency. And they gave me none of that." His voice cracked at the end, but he didn't care. Deborah paused before answering. "All right then, we'll see it through." The fire had been lit. A day later, the story hit the news. Sitting judge wrongfully arrested by Plano police. They showed his bruised wrists, his face, his mugshot. Viewers across Texas were stunned, but not everyone was surprised. Black residents in the city, in the state, had seen this before. This was just another version of the same story. What made this different was that this time, the man in the cuffs had the power to speak up and call it out. The city scrambled. The police department promised a full review. The two officers, Detectives Brandon Keller and Scott Martinez, were placed on administrative leave while an internal investigation took place, but they didn't know who would be sitting on the bench when they walked into that hearing. The following Monday, Judge Ellison stood at his kitchen window, staring out at his driveway. His car was still there, parked in the same spot, but something had changed. His wife, Simone, set a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him, but didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, concerned. "You sure you're ready to go back?" she asked. Ray nodded slowly. "I've been ready since they opened that car door." She sat down across from him, folding her hands. "You looked different when you came home that morning. Not angry, not shaken, just done. Like something inside you was tired in a way I haven't seen before." He didn't answer. He just took a sip of his coffee. Later that day, Ray was back in his chambers at the Collin County Courthouse, his robe hanging on the coat hook, his nameplate back on the door. But this time, the attention on him was different. His assistant, Kenny, peeked in with a file. "You've got Internal Affairs coming in tomorrow. You still want to be on the bench for it?" Ray nodded. "Yeah, if they've got a problem with it, they can file a motion." Kenny smirked. "Bet they won't." The city was buzzing. Local activists were organizing, and one group even launched a petition to get the officers fired. Another group called for citywide training reforms. The NAACP held a press conference calling Judge Ellison's arrest a symbol of a much larger problem. News vans parked outside his house for days. Commentators on TV debated whether his role as a judge gave him an unfair advantage, as if he hadn't earned his place, as if being humiliated publicly wasn't enough. But Ray didn't engage with the cameras. He stayed focused on the hearing. Internal Affairs had scheduled the hearing for Friday morning at 9 a.m. The officers thought they were walking into a typical inquiry. They hadn't bothered to check the docket. They hadn't bothered to learn who the judge would be. Maybe they thought it would be someone else, someone who didn't understand what it was like to have a badge pointed at them, someone who didn't understand the sting of being falsely accused. As they stepped into courtroom 2B, the first thing they saw was his name, Judge Raymond Ellison, engraved on the plaque beneath the Texas seal. Then they saw him, sitting behind the bench, wearing his robe, his eyes fixed on them. Detective Keller froze mid-step, while Detective Martinez's face went pale. They didn't speak. Ray didn't flinch. He leaned forward, tapped the gavel, and spoke calmly into the microphone. "Court is now in session." For a full 10 seconds, no one moved. The sound of the gavel echoed faintly through the room, but no one in that room could pretend this was just another case. Finally, Keller glanced at his attorney, then at Ray. His lips parted slightly, but he didn't speak. Martinez kept his eyes low, avoiding Ray's gaze. Ray scanned the courtroom, not just at the officers, but at everyone in the room. The clerk, the internal affairs representatives, the court reporter. All of them were watching him, wondering how he would respond. He tapped his finger on the bench twice, leaned forward and said, "Let the record show that the hearing regarding the administrative conduct of Detectives Keller and Martinez will proceed as scheduled. I see no cause for recusal." There was a thick silence in the room, but Ray didn't break it. He continued, "I will not serve as judge, jury, and executioner, but I will preside over this hearing as required by my position. If any party has an objection, speak now." Nobody spoke. The proceedings began. Sergeant Olivia Chen, the internal affairs officer, called her first witness, a middle-aged woman who had witnessed the arrest from her living room window. She took the stand, voice trembling, as she described how she had watched from behind her curtain as her neighbor, the man with the black BMW, was slammed against his own car. "I knew it was him," she said. "He always waves when he sees me walking my dog. He's always polite, but that night they didn't give him a chance." The body cam footage played on the screen, silent at first, showing Ray's face, blurry and framed by flashlight glare. Then the sound kicked in, and the room heard it all. "I live here. I can show you my ID. I'm a sitting judge." "Stop resisting." "I'm not resisting. I'm trying to identify myself." The room was silent as the footage played. Keller shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Martinez looked like he wanted to disappear. Their attorney tried to interrupt, but Ray raised a hand. "You'll have time for cross. Right now I'm listening." Each clip, each testimony, each pause spoke louder than words ever could. Finally, Ray looked directly at the two officers. "Would either of you like to make a statement?" Keller glanced at Martinez, then back at Ray. His lips parted slightly, but he said nothing. "No, Your Honor," Keller muttered. Ray nodded slowly. He looked at the clock. 1:47 a.m. Some things are hard to forget. Raymond Ellison leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in front of him. But what neither of the officers realized was that the hardest part of this whole ordeal was just beginning. The courtroom doors shut with a soft click, and for a moment, it felt like everyone held their breath. Raymond didn't move at first. He simply sat, his fingers pressed together beneath his chin, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He wasn't just a judge anymore. In that moment, he was a man who had felt the weight of what so many others had lived through for years. This wasn't just a story or a theory to him. It was personal. His heart had felt it. He took a slow breath. "Detective Keller, Detective Martinez," Raymond began, his voice even but steady. "I've reviewed the footage. I've heard the testimony. This is your chance to explain to me what happened that night, from your perspective." Silence settled over the room, thick and tense. Then reluctantly, Keller cleared his throat, standing up. "Your Honor," he said, not quite meeting Raymond's eyes, "we responded to a call about a suspicious vehicle in a quiet neighborhood. It was late, and the house had no lights on. We approached with caution. The subject refused to get out of the vehicle and didn't identify himself immediately. Given the circumstances, we followed standard procedure." Raymond tilted his head slightly, his voice calm but sharp. "You say he didn't identify himself. What exactly did he say when you approached?" "He said he lived there," Keller responded, his words hesitant. "He mentioned being a judge, but we didn't." He faltered, searching for the right words. "We didn't know if it was true." Raymond interrupted, his gaze never leaving Keller's face. "So he told you he lived there, and he told you who he was. What part of that didn't count as identifying himself?" Keller blinked, trying to process the question, but all he could offer was a meek, "We didn't know if it was true. That's why we carry radios, to verify things, not escalate them." Keller sat back down, and Raymond turned to Martinez. "Anything to add?" Martinez shook his head. "No, sir." Raymond leaned forward, his voice steady as he addressed Martinez. "Let me ask you something, Detective. If I had been a white man sitting in that same car, wearing the same hoodie, do you think we'd be sitting here today?" Martinez's lips pressed into a thin line. I I don't know, Your Honor." "That's fair," Raymond said softly. "I didn't expect you to." The weight of his words didn't need to rise. They hit harder because of the calm restraint behind them. Raymond turned his attention to the internal affairs team. "You've seen the evidence. You've heard from the officers. So have I. But before we finish, I want to share something, not as a judge, but as a man who spent the night in a holding cell." Everyone in the room leaned in just slightly. The court reporter even paused for a moment. Raymond's voice broke the silence. "When they arrested me, they didn't see a judge. They didn't even see a human being," he said, his eyes flickering over to the officers. "They saw a black man in a nice car, parked in a neighborhood they didn't think I belonged in. That was it. No questions, no hesitation, just hands on guns and orders shouted at me." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "I've seen young men, women, kids even, in this courtroom who've been charged for doing far less than what you two did to me, and I've had to sentence them, not because I wanted to, but because the law told me to." Raymond's gaze lifted to the ceiling for a moment, gathering himself before his voice softened, yet carried a weight that held everyone in the room. "But today, I get to choose. Today, I get to weigh this, not just with the law, but with my conscience." He fell silent again, letting the stillness fill the space between them. Finally, he spoke again, turning back to the internal affairs team. "The officer's conduct was excessive, unjustified, and deeply inappropriate," he said quietly. "The question now is whether it was criminal. That's your decision to investigate further. But as for me—" He paused, looking directly at Keller and Martinez, his eyes steady, his voice unwavering. "I don't want revenge. I don't want apologies. You don't owe me that. What I want is change, and I want you both to carry the weight of this moment for the rest of your careers. Every time you pull someone over, every time you flash a badge, I want you to remember the man you arrested without even asking his name." The room held its breath again, and no one spoke. Raymond stood slowly, his movements deliberate. "I recommend mandatory de-escalation training, a full department review, and a 30-day suspension without pay for both officers." Whispers began to hum through the room, some murmuring that it wasn't enough, others sighing in relief. But Raymond wasn't done. "I hope that one day you both become the kind of officers who don't just follow orders, but understand the responsibility you carry every time you put that badge on," he added, his voice still steady. He glanced down at the bench, then back at the room. "Court is adjourned." The silence in the room was different now. Not the silence of being ignored or locked away, but the silence of something being understood, something shifting. Later, Raymond sat alone in his chambers, his robe hanging over the back of his chair. The room felt empty, but in a way that was quieter than before. Not the silence of being dismissed, but the silence of aftermath. His fingers hovered over the file on his desk, his final ruling, signed and sealed. The knock at the door was gentle, almost hesitant. Simone stepped in, her coat still draped over her shoulders, her eyes scanning him carefully. She didn't say much since the hearing. She had just watched him carry a weight most people could never comprehend. "You did what you had to do," she said softly. "I did what I could live with," he replied quietly. She sat across from him, reaching for his hand. "Some people are upset you didn't come down harder on them." He nodded. "Yeah, they wanted blood." "Why didn't you?" she asked, her voice soft with curiosity. Raymond leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting toward the ceiling as he thought. "Because I know what revenge feels like. It burns fast, feels righteous, but it doesn't build anything. The people watching me today, young men like I used to be, they needed to see restraint, not rage. Simone studied him closely. Do you still believe in the system? Raymond gave a small smile. I believe in people. I believe people can change. Systems, that depends on who's running them. There was a pause before she asked with a knowing look. You ever think about retiring? Raymond chuckled softly. Every morning, then I remember why I started. Outside, the city of Plano reacted to the events. News outlets replayed Raymond's words, dissecting every part of the footage, some praising his dignity, others criticizing him for being too soft. But among all the noise, a few voices emerged that mattered more than any headline. A young officer from another district posted about watching the hearing and realizing how easily he could have been the one on trial. A teacher used the footage in her classroom, sparking a discussion about authority and humanity. One of Raymond's former law students left him a voicemail. Judge, I just wanted to say, watching you today reminded me why I went to law school. Thank you. Required to undergo de-escalation and racial bias training, every single officer, top to bottom. Detectives Keller and Martinez were suspended without pay for 30 days, and when they returned, they'd be reassigned, no longer working patrol. No public apology, but the change spoke louder than any words ever could. Raymond didn't attend the press conference. He didn't need to. He was back to work in the same courtroom, same chair, same robe, but nothing felt the same. He could feel the change in the air, in the way officers walked into his courtroom now, straighter, quieter, as though they knew they were standing before someone who had lived the truth, not just studied it. One morning, as Raymond stepped out of his car, a young high school student waited by the door. Judge Ellison? The boy asked, his voice trembling slightly. Yes, Raymond replied. I wanted to say thank you for standing up, for not yelling, for showing how to fight without throwing punches. Raymond smiled. You planning on going into law? The boy nodded, and Raymond's smile grew. Good. Then make sure you remember this. This, he gestured to his chest, to his skin, will always mean something to some people, but it never has to define who you become. They shook hands. The boy walked away with his shoulders a little higher, and Raymond Ellison walked into the courthouse, not just as a judge, but as a reminder. Sometimes the most powerful form of justice isn't punishment. It's forcing the system to see you and still choosing not to become what it tried to make you. If this story moved you, share it. Let someone know that dignity can't be stripped away with handcuffs, and that real change begins when we refuse to stay silent.